This is Ugly Old Goat, and before I begin my reading, I just want to invite you to the Financial Summit of 2022. It's in the Dominican Republic. It's from August 1st to August 6th. It's sponsored by my good friend Tone Vase, and apparently he's got a whole castle rented. It's a luxurious resort, and this is one event I just recommend you do not miss. It's great for if you're a trading professional. If you have a family office and you're a financial entrepreneur, this is the one event that you need to go to. The Goat Lady and I will both be there, and this is one of the few events that I attend. So just want to give that invitation. The website, of course, is thefinancialsummit.com, so please give that a visit, and now we'll start the reading. This is Ugly Old Goat. And I'm going to read through my article, my critical review on the Fiat standard. Subtitle, The Debt Slavery Alternative to Human Civilization. I fudged a bit on this one. I wanted to read Saifedean Ammous' second book as it was being written and made available on his website. I've been a member of his website since the outset because the first book, The Bitcoin Standard, had a huge personal impact on me, so much so that Saif was hands down the recipient of the first Bitcoin Standard Bearer in 2018. Unfortunately, time constraints would not allow me to read the book in progress made available to fellow members. Saif deserves credit for making the draft available to members as he was drafting it. This was a brave thing to do and a great teaching mechanism. I think this is an aspect the ivory tower crowd critics miss. There tends to be scholarly envy of Saifedean's rise from an unknown broke scholar trapped in Lebanon to a world-renowned spokesman for Bitcoin through bootstrapping his own talents and reaching the masses by practicing what he preaches. What impresses me is not just Saif's accomplishments, but that he teaches by example, with integrity, by living out the principles that he teaches. His life and accomplishments are an untold Horatio Algier story. He has even started his own publishing house, the Saif House. After reading a not-so-rave review from the academic world, I thought it was past time I check out the book on the membership website to see what all the fuss was about. And I'm glad I did, as he provides a wealth of information that is worth every penny of the $100 annual membership, which admittedly I have not taken advantage of and subscribed merely to support his work without ever visiting the website. Before I begin, I do want to refer to my review of the Bitcoin Standard that I published in May 2018. The only shortcoming I found in the Bitcoin Standard was the omission of the organic development of the gold standard, like Bitcoin's immaculate conception, through non-inflationary money creation of self-liquidating commercial paper. But since that was not the primary purpose for writing the Bitcoin Standard, it was no big deal. The Fiat Standard is far more ambitious and also reveals the foundational propositions of Saifedean's thinking. The presupposition is that fiat, or decreed anything, by men, is evil. The results are topics and even chapters on fiat food, fiat fuels, fiat science, fiat architecture, fiat education, fiat energy, fiat family, and fiat life. And since money is the lifeblood of an economy, fiat money compounds the evil on every other fiat it touches. While others are dismissive, I find this premise fascinating and worth developing. My mentor on sound money was E.C. Harwood, from whom I learned over 40 years ago the three greatest swindles in the history of mankind are inflation, entitlements, and regulation. Regulation only comes about by fiat or decree. So in this sense, Saifedean's thinking is spot on with my own thinking. Again, much of the criticism of the Fiat Standard is that it simply does not fit the academic mold. These scholars just don't get it. While repetition may be tedious for the scholar, it is the way we common people learn, and this is why Saif has a following other scholars envy. He has taken a simple approach and has applied it to every aspect of life. The Fiat Standard is not only a scholarly work written in an academic economic journal. Let's start that again. The Fiat Standard is not a scholarly work written in an academic economic journal for the ivory tower crowd and never was intended to be. Rather, it was written to reach out to the common man with a vision and common sense understanding in much the same way common sense reached the common man to explain the American Revolution. It is only when the common man has an understanding of sound money equal to, and in most instances beyond, the ivory tower crowd, that sound money is fiat accompli. It is in this manner that the fiat standard succeeds famously in the same way the Bitcoin standard succeeded famously, reaching the common man in over 25 different languages. The fact that the fiat standard emphasizes a timeless general principle rather than a new technical innovation means this work will flourish even should Bitcoin fail. 40 years ago, any discussion of sound money was locked in a small discredited box in academia and followed by a small tin hat crowd of public opinion. Today, Bitcoin is a hot topic for discussion, and the price is even featured on the local radio station alongside with the Dow Jones Industrial Index and the price of gold. What was ignored and nearly taboo 40 years ago is now cool and a hot topic for public discussion and colloquy. This does not diminish the role or need for scholarship, nor does it mean the fiat standard is beyond criticism. If anything, both the need for scholarship and criticism is more pronounced. Saifedean's work has made the discussion of sound money relevant to this generation in a way that did not exist a generation ago. What this means is that within the sound money movement in general, and Bitcoin in particular, there is a large latitude for healthy in-house debate. More importantly, the issue of sound money has been expanded to those with little or no interest in Bitcoin. I enjoyed Saifedean's section on sound monetary policy, which further develops the idea that a return of the 19th century gold standard is the most destructive thing that can happen to Bitcoin. This is a quote. While many Bitcoiners are dismissive of the monetary role of gold as being an analog, heavy, inefficient version of Bitcoin, I would urge them to be more cautious, as gold has been written off many times before, and yet has been playing a monetary role for thousands of years. And there are good reasons to still believe its days are not over yet. Quoting from Chapter 17 of the Fiat Standard Course. Saif concludes with what would likely be construed as Bitcoin heresy if he was not an impeccable Bitcoin maximalist source. Quoting again, while Bitcoin is indeed free market money, it does not necessarily follow that Bitcoin would succeed on a free market for money. The longer I think of this, the more I begin to consider the possibility that Bitcoin is a free market solution to the problem of government control over money, but is not necessarily the money that would be chosen on a market free of government control. Quoting from Chapter 17 of the Fiat Standard Course. Put it simply, if we have sound money, Bitcoin has no use case. It should be noted that the quotations above are taken out of the Fiat Standard Course, available only on Saif's website. Only after I completed the course did I purchase the ebook and a hardcover book. Unfortunately, what I like in the course seems to be edited out of the final printing. With all this said, Saifedean's bias, I suspected in my review of the Bitcoin standard, is fully revealed in the Fiat Standard. Heading, Saifedean Ammous fails to apply the Fiat Standard to 100% reserve banking. Buying into the premise that all fiat decrees or regulation by men are bad, why does a Fiat 100% gold standard or Fiat 100% Bitcoin standard get a pass? We all tend to get blinded by our own confirmation bias, and this one is a doozy. Saifedean Ammous fails to recognize the classical gold standard emerged organically through relatively free market banking in the 19th century Gilded Age, or what he terms the Belle Epoch, in much the same way Bitcoin has emerged in the 21st century. He confuses gold warehousing as one and the same with the truly innovative 19th century gold standard that emerged organically in the American era without a central bank, and hence concludes all fractional reserve standards are inflationary because they are fiat or decreed money that does not and cannot represent new wealth being offered in the marketplace. Quoting Saifedean, quote, the argument for the necessity of fractional reserve banking ultimately boils down to the same arguments that Keynesians, inflation apologists, and monetary cranks of all hues use for monetary expansion in general. An increase in the supply of money will lead to more economic production. By this logic, banks that can create loans in excess of capital they hold in reserve can mobilize more capital and finance more projects, resulting in less employment and increased prosperity. Conversely, if banks are prevented from engaging in fractional reserve banking, a shortage of credit would hamper economic activity, reduce production, and reduce living standards. By using fractional reserve banking to decouple available credit from savings, society benefits overall. At least this is what Keynesians believe. The problem with this logic is that the same as with all inflationist arguments, money and credit by themselves are not productive assets. They merely represent receipts that allow their holders to purchase productive assets. An increase in the supply of money or credit will no more increase the stock of productive assets in an economy than an increase in printed football stadium tickets will increase the capacity of the stadium itself. The ticket is merely a proxy for a seat in the stadium, and money and credit are but claims on final products and capital goods used in their production. Should a football team wish to increase the maximum number of tickets it sells, it cannot do so by simply increasing the number of tickets it prints. Instead, it would have to increase the stadium's capacity, which requires engineers, workers, and heavy capital equipment to complete. Printing tickets beyond the capacity of the stadium would result in more spectators and seats and a conflict over these seats, but it cannot, under any circumstance imaginable, cause an increase in the number of seats. There can be no such thing as shortage of money or shortage of credit. Whatever supply of money an economy is using is always sufficient to supply all the needs of the economy, provided the money itself is divisible enough. The demand for money is always higher than the supply because people desire more things than they produce, and because desiring is far easier than producing. In the Fiat standard, it appears that these desires can be satisfied with more money, but the creation of money to meet these desires does nothing to produce the objects of desire. The sought-after good can only be created by dedicating scarce resources to its production. In a free market, people dedicate their time to production in order to make money, and as the number of goods and number of economic production increases, the supply of money need not increase, but its value will naturally rise. Bold emphasis added. It should be noted that in the Fiat Standard course, Saif prefaces the above paragraph with the following. The fundamental premise on which fractional reserve banking is built is inherently flawed. Bold emphasis added. Now, Saif continues, quote, fractional reserve banking does not magically create more capital, labor, or resources. It merely entrusts their allocation to central banks, rather than the productive, conscientious people who produce and save them. Fractional reserve banking is a form of central planning that impoverishes society overall but enriches banks and politically connected individuals. Without fractional reserve banking and the fiat that it protects, capital and labor would flow to the highest bidder that will always tend to be the entrepreneur who uses capital and labor most productively. This would encourage people to save as free market forces work to efficiently allocate resources according to the most productive and valuable endeavors. With the bank credit creation of the fiat system, capital allocation becomes increasingly political and centrally planned, and failed users of capital can still continue to control it if they are allowed to create credit. The market's natural process of creative destruction and reallocation of resources is thwarted the more that credit is politically manifested rather than generated from savers. Bold emphasis added. All quotes are from Chapter 6 of the Fiat Standard Bank Profitability. The same premise is expanded in Chapter 15 entitled Full Reserve Banking. Quote, the degree to which a bank can get away with fractional reserve banking is a positive function of the cost of final settlement of the monetary asset and ease of debasing the monetary asset. Under a gold standard, the cost and time required to move gold around are relatively high, so the economies of scale from centralization will provide existing banks a degree of leeway in extending unbacked credit without their depositors noticing or being able to do anything about it. Yet this system is not very sustainable because the longer it lasts, the safer banks feel, the more risks they take until it comes crashing down, as was the case during the 19th century. Since it was not easy to increase the supply of gold on demand and no lender of the last resort can print it or bail out banks engaged in fractionally lending gold-backed notes, fractional reserve banking was the bug that kept on derailing the gold standard. Eventually, the gold standard itself was sacrificed to keep fractional reserve banking alive when a dollar-based standard was used for settlement. This makes settlement entirely centralized with a government monopoly while leaving the currency elastic to the demands of the banking sector. The logical fallacy of asserting the consequent is repeated in the conclusion of Chapter 17 of the Fiat Standard Course. Quoting Saifedean, a gold standard would curtail the ability of government to intervene in the banking system and protect incumbents from outsiders, which would likely unleash innovation and experimentation in financial systems. With free market competition and innovation, it is not difficult to imagine the development of highly convenient payment technologies backed by gold. There is no reason that any of the modern payment innovations developed over fiat money and digital currencies cannot be implemented from on top of gold with 100% reserve banking. Chapter 17, the Fiat Standard Course, bold emphasis added. Saife's 100% Bitcoin reserve standard. Saife fails to apply the fiat standard to his own 100% reserve standard. He is guilty of the same logical error committed by Murray Rothbard in the case for a 100% gold dollar of asserting the consequent. So what Saife fails to do, I shall attempt to do. It is not fractional reserves that cause the mischief. It is fiat fractional reserves that cause the mischief and leads to all kinds of problems. And this is true whether the fiat fractional reserve is 400%, 120%, 100%, 80%, 40%, 20%, 5%, 2%, or 0%. These are fiat reserves advocated by a particular or peculiar bias. Each proclaims to have the magic beans for a workable sound money system. They are all fiat solutions requiring fiat banking. No such magic beans emerged in the organic development of the gold standard. What emerged was not a fiat reserve or fiat banking, but a reserve discovered and modified through self-liquidating commercial paper, or what E.C. Harwood described as the lost art of commercial banking. What emerged was not money created ex nihilo by fiat, but rather credit expansion and contraction, bold emphasis, determined by the new wealth coming into and purchased in the marketplace. Self-liquidating commercial paper represents new productive assets offered in the market, and this non-inflationary money creation is retired as these assets are purchased in the market. The Gilded Age was enabled by this organic discovery before there was a Federal Reserve central bank. It worked so well the Fed nationalized it. There is such a thing as shortage of credit under fiat 100% reserve. Whether that reserve is gold or Bitcoin, when wealth is brought into the marketplace, any decreed reserve causes all kinds of mischief, including a fiat 100% reserve. A fiat 100% reserve limits growth. Saife acknowledges this. He's willing to sacrifice profitable enterprises so that only the most profitable enterprises have access to credit. Of course, margins in business vary, and margins within the same industry vary over time. 100% reserve, fiat reserve, or no fiat reserve. There is a school of Austrian economics, largely influenced by Murray Rothbard, that holds that anything less than a 100% gold standard is criminal, and if it were possible, would submit an entire nation to a 100% gold standard. There's a similar school in technology that anything less than 100% Bitcoin standard is criminal. As E.C. Harwood writes, quote, among the gold standard advocates are found the 100% reserve proponents who would restrict the purchasing media to use in use to gold and perhaps silver coins or paper currency and to checking accounts directly representing these. They would go back to medieval times before the earliest beginnings of sound commercial banking. How they would cope with the flood of products to be marketed in a modern industrial civilization, they do not suggest, nor do they seem to realize that a problem exists. Bitcoiners with technological backgrounds tend to view gold as a barbarous relic, not unlike John Maynard Keynes. The reason fiat 100% reserves don't work is exactly due to what Saif describes. This would encourage people to save as free market forces work to efficiently allocate sources according to the most productive and valuable endeavors. Of course, what Saif describes is hypothetical because it has never existed except as gold warehousing. Just like Rothbard's 100% gold dollar, Saif is pushing the string for his own bias. The point is that all profitable enterprises create new wealth in the markets. Thus, all are creditworthy. Why should free market banking be limited to only the most productive and valuable endeavors? Why limit wealth? Why limit growth of enterprises to only the most profitable ventures? Self-custody Bitcoin hodlers are the bank of last resort on a free market Bitcoin sound commercial banking standard. Self-liquidating commercial paper that emerged organically in the markets in the late 19th century solved this problem. There were no fixed or decreed reserves. Free market banking determined the money supply. Free market banking expands the money supply as new wealth is created and contracts the money supply as these goods are sold in the market. This was the innovative gold standard that emerged during the 19th century Gilded Age. The analogy of a football stadium falls apart. It assumes stagnant wealth and a zero-sum game. New wealth coming into the market does not have assigned seating. It is more like unassigned folding chairs and a bundle of other items brought into the stadium. The money created representing this wealth are tickets that are retired once the folding chairs and other items are claimed. A better analogy is there are folding chairs, food services, haircuts, computers, cars, car parts, tools, clothing, and a plethora of other items and services that can be carried home after the game, the purchase, from the market stadium, since the tickets are not for any number of things, not assigned seats. The spectators are not spectators at all, but participants in the field, also known as a market, something the ivory tower crowd fails to grasp since they tend to watch and analyze the game rather than actually participate in the market stadium. Honest bankers recognized the problem and estimated the value of goods being offered in the market by wealth producers and then issued non-inflationary specie to these wealth producers based on the standard at the gates of the stadium market, based on the estimated worth of the new wealth on the standard, and secured the specie with this new wealth. Now, whether the stadium market money is based on the 19th century gold standard, not gold, but the gold standard or meter stick, or based on the 21st century Bitcoin standard, not Bitcoin, but the Bitcoin standard or meter stick, or both, part of the wealth claimed could be gold or Bitcoin, depending on the standard banked on, as well as a free market between the two standards. These wealth producers pay their suppliers and workers before the stadium market opens in compensation for their contributions. When the stadium market closes at the end of the day, end of the week, end of the month, the producers repay the loan from the proceeds of the sales of their particular wealth sold in the market stadium. The suppliers and workers leave the stadium market with a variety of new wealth offered and save the unused specie for use in a future market, or float, which is known as a float. Let us assume a worst-case scenario of a short squeeze where during the course of the game, the price of Bitcoin or gold is driven sharply higher. Let's say 2x or 10x or 100x or even 1,000x. It matters not the multiple or even the time frame. At some point, even a sound bank may find the need to suspend redemption of the standard, to use Hayek's term, just like Jimmy Stewart's in It's a Wonderful Life. Is the bank solvent? Well, according to Murray Rothbard and a decreed Fiat 100% reserve standard, the bank is insolvent because it is unable to redeem the specie and Hayek standard, whatever that standard might be, gold or Bitcoin. No, the bank is not insolvent. While it may be necessary to temporarily suspend redemption in the standard, the 10x or 1000x price increase of the Hayek standard enables hodlers with self-custody to purchase 10x or 1000x more wealth offered on the Stadium marketplace. For sound banks, suspension of redemption in the standard is a temporary situation that self-corrects. And naturally, it self-corrects naturally and quickly, so long as the market is free to operate if suspension happens at all. The market mechanism of a higher standard price means much less non-inflationary purchasing media is created as the price of the standard is rising. This market force makes suspension of redemption less likely and a rare exceptional occurrence. This is because as the price of the standard increases, new deposits from hodlers flow into the bank to take advantage of the windfall purchasing power of 10x or 1000x earlier in the day, week, month, or year. The self-correcting free marketplace regulates the money supply, not a fiat reserve. In the event of redemption suspension, any new issue is further curtailed and may cease entirely, especially if the specie is suspect. As purchases are made, the non-inflationary purchasing media is retired and the reserves and redemption are restored by new deposits as hodlers learn of the windfall and rush to the stadium market to purchase wealth they could not previously afford. In this sense, self-custody hodlers act as the decentralized bank of last resort. Self-custody hodlers willingly bail out the sound banks, while unsound banks are diminished or fail entirely. Self-custody hodlers provide added reserve to free market banking in exchange for their digital fixed supply asset for the new supply of tangible asset that comes with wealth creation in markets and free banking. This is not a sum-zero gain, but a win-win-win-win for the wealth producers, their workers and suppliers, the bankers who fill the gap, and the hodlers who save for the future and provide liquidity when needed. Unsound banks will suffer from a more prolonged suspension and be diminished as sound banks grow. The worst cases of fraud will result in default and even bankruptcy. This is because unsound banknotes are worth less than those issued by a sound bank, and may even be worthless in the event of fraud or complete malfeasance. Free banking acts as a cleansing mechanism to weed out unsound banks. In a very real sense, sound commercial Bitcoin banking paves the way for what Parker Lewis terms the definancialization of money. Nor is this scenario without precedent. Similar situations happen from time to time in the commodities markets, like with the 1980 Hunt silver squeeze. In the commodities markets, retail customers suffered no losses. If an exchange member is insolvent and that member goes broke, the other members eat the difference from the retail customers. The clearinghouse members take the hit, not the public, so the integrity of the clearinghouse is preserved. Commodity exchanges with physical delivery are the closest thing to a free market on the planet. There is no reason that free market banking cannot and will not develop a similar clearinghouse model. Self-custody Bitcoin hodlers are the bank of last resort on a free market Bitcoin sound commercial banking standard. This is why Bitcoin provides hope. Sound commercial banking is a lost art that must be relearned and applied to Bitcoin by this generation. Bank charters. Only because the gold standard was regulated through charters and later nationalized through the Federal Reserve System were arbitrary reserves imposed by decree or fiat. The gold standard failed only after reserves were determined by political pressure rather than the market forces that enabled it to emerge and work so well in the first place. Even the Fed gets it. In a 2016 study by the Philadelphia Federal Reserve concluded, quote, A close analysis of the free banking era does not support the view that egregious risk-taking and fraud were the primary cause of bank failures. The main cause of the large number of bank failures under free banking was collateral restrictions that left banks at the mercy of ups and downs of state finances and the resulting volatility of state bond values. The bottom line is that much of the free banking or wildcat banking era was really not free. To issue state charters required reserves and state bonds, which were unstable because they did not represent new wealth entering the marketplace. All fractional reserves are created by fiat. So in that sense, Saif is correct. Quoting Saif, fractional reserve banking is a form of central planning that impoverishes society overall, but enriches banks and politically connected individuals. A decreed 100% reserve is really a warehousing operation and also a fraction. And while it does not benefit the politically connected banks, it also never worked as a bank and never existed as a bank. A 100% reserve standard in banking is a myth used for illustration, much like the illustration of barter was created to develop economics. Even Saif admits a fiat 100% reserve can serve only the most marginally profitable businesses, which also explains why warehousing is not banking. Warehousing can have 120% reserves or 400% reserves, but such reserves are not without associated costs. In the real world, it's called excessive inventory. I ran into the same problem in the 1980s when, upon the suggestion of Colonel Harwood, I looked into starting a tontine insurance agreement on the gold standard. However, a Missouri state-chartered insurance company required a large percentage of reserves be held in dollars, specifically state bonds. But setting aside the fiat reserve requirements in state bonds or treasury notes or whatever, a fixed reserve of any kind simply is not responsive to the needs of the marketplace. A fixed reserve too high restricts credit to marginally profitable businesses. A fiat too low encourages lending to unprofitable businesses. What is too low or too high should not be decreed by the fiat standard, but can and should be determined by the living dynamics of the marketplace. This was the great innovation of the gold standard of the 19th century, just as Bitcoin is the great digital innovation of the 21st century. But very few understood this in the 19th century as it emerged. Very few really understood the gold standard in E.C. Harwood's time, and very few understand it today. And many who do choose to ignore it because it does not fit their political agenda. Small note restrictions. Further, regulation prohibited lucrative small note issue for use in everyday commerce. Quoting, long before the first commercial bank was chartered in the United States, Americans had a long and relatively successful experience with small denomination notes. An unfavorable balance of payments and Britain's limitations in specie exports, even to the colonies, created a chronic shortage of small silver. Small denomination notes were the obvious response. They were especially popular among retail merchants for whom the lack of specie was most detrimental. Colonial loan offices and land banks responded by issuing a credit of less than 20 shillings to alleviate deficiency of small silver and copper pieces. Between 1723 and 1755, Pennsylvania issues 78% of its bills of credits in denominations less than £1. New Jersey about 70%. And this is, again, quoting Hansen in 1980. Small note issue was lucrative for banks that needed to raise capital quickly as they circulated with wide use and limited redemptions. Yet the issue was restricted by the market. Quoting again, if small notes were only rarely redeemed as contemporaries contended, why did banks issue so few of them? Why, in fact, did several Virginia banks refuse to issue them when mandated to do so? H.C. Carey offered the answer in 1838. $1 notes, said Carey, will not be used unless the benefit derived from them exceed the cost of furnishing them. And if they do so, their use is beneficial to the whole community. Banks had a supply had to supply a medium that the public demanded. At the same time, issuing small notes imposed real costs on the banks. The optimal number of small notes was determined, as in any market, by the relative benefits and costs of the marginal small note emission. The nature of the banks determined the benefits, while the redemption mechanisms determined the costs. New England banknotes were relatively small. New England banks were relatively small concerns catering to freeholders, merchants, tradesmen, textiles, and the bank supplied them with working capital to purchase supplies and wages. Since the daily earnings of a mason was about $1.62 and those of a carpenter about $1.45, large denomination notes would have been of little use. Virginia banks, on the other hand, were largely branched institutions that specialized in credit to planters and tobacco factors during the spring planting and autumn vesting and shipping seasons. Large transactions between planters, factors, European buyers, and banks required few small notes. Virginia banks issued few small notes because their principal customer had little use for them. Emphasis added. New England was not coincidentally Calvinistic. Small notes also imposed costs on the banks. As more notes were issued, banks had to hold larger specie balances to meet potential redemption demands, and specie tied up in idle balances meant foregone interest income. Any strategy that diminished average daily redemptions meant less interest foregone, and banks pursued a variety of strategies to avoid redemption. Some banks issued notes in one town and made them redeemable in another. Others issued notes to borrowers with the understanding that the notes would not be redeemed before a stipulated date. If the notes were returned prior to the date, the borrower paid a penalty. The most common strategy, according to contemporary critics, was to issue small notes. If a bank afforded no distrust, people would not redeem small notes because redemption offered little marginal benefit. The above highlighted description of New England banknote issue was a near identical description of Harwood's sound commercial banking, where new specie represented the new wealth introduced in the marketplace. Note banking emerged not to bank the unbanked, but to bank producers of wealth created by freeholders, merchants, tradesmen, and textile mills. The Bitcoin lack of specie situation in early America is not unlike the current. Wow, that's an error I've got to correct. I'm going to pause and I'll just correct it now. I just need to take out Bitcoin. All right. The lack of species situation in early America is not unlike the current species shortage in El Salvador, where there is a gulf between needed specie and prevailing technology. Old-fashioned banknotes have the potential to bridge the gap and may yet prove to be the preferred system for cash. And there's, I put in some pictures here of an artist's rendition of what a Bitcoin standard note might look like. One standard, which would be about 4 cents or 3 cents today, since Bitcoin is about $30,000. 10 standards would be about 30 cents. 5 standards would be about 15 cents. So again, these are useful notes in a large part of the world. Limited jurisdiction and branch restrictions. State chartered banks also had limited jurisdiction and many restricted branching. Due to communication problems persistent before the telegraph and transportation limitations during early railroad development, it simply was not an issue that could be resolved, but it did create problems. Traveling by horse and wagon on bad roads was cumbersome. The term Wildcat Bank came from a dishonest bank of Detroit, population 600, in the then territory of Michigan, established in 1806 for the purpose of deliberate fraud. The scam was to print beautiful banknotes from a bank where the Wildcats roamed. Boston was 800 miles away. Smart Easterners took advantage of these country folk by purchasing the notes at a 30% discount. When they tried to redeem them at face value in 1808, they found the Bank of Detroit had closed its doors. There's a picture of one of the Detroit Bank's banknotes. Now, the innovation of fixed supply causes volatility. Since its inception, Bitcoin has unprecedented volatility with sharp price 10x increases, with sharp price 10x and 100x price increases followed by 80 to 90% declines. This is hardly suited for a fair or useful debit and credit system. Many have attributed this to its novelty and expect the volatility to diminish with greater acceptance. Yet this is by no means assured, and the evidence suggests otherwise. Unlike other commodities such as crude oil or gold, Bitcoin uniquely has a fixed supply, and the case can be made this fixed supply is the root cause for such volatility. Yet, even with 100x price increases and 90% corrections, even if they remain the norm, this does not diminish the Bitcoin use as Hayek standard. Sound commercial banking. Sound commercial banking did not emerge from banking the unbanked, which seems to be the version of some altruistic Bitcoiners. In most cases, the unbanked are unbanked for a reason. There's little reason to expect this will change. Rather, sound commercial banking emerged from the need of producers of wealth to finance acquisition, production, and ultimately sale of this new wealth offered in the marketplace without decreed fixed reserves from a central authority. Quoting Andrea Biancani, the proper functioning of a commercial banking system is vital for the development of capitalistic economies. Its two primary functions are savings and lending, which revolve around making a profit between interest paid on savings and that charged on the loans. But banks can lend either by drawing from the deposits and savings they collected or by creating new money. Harwood posits that the discriminating factor is to create new money only when such money goes into productive investments, which is when this money increases the quantity of goods and services in circulation. I.e., a company builds a plant to manufacture cars, and not when this money finances consumer spending or any other non-productive investment, i.e., an individual gets a loan to buy a car. In the first case, the banker can create new money because this is non-inflationary. In the second case, the purchase shall be rather financed by drawing from savings and deposits because creating new money not offset by an increased amount of productive goods would be inflationary. This need is becoming evident with the collapse of the fiat standard and the emergence of the Bitcoin standard. Competition in this new venue has opened the door to relearn the lost art of commercial banking for small and large producers alike, but especially the small producer without access to the fiat money standard. Herein lies the hope of the Bitcoin standard's emergence. Further, since sound commercial banking is based on the standard, new wealth creation is encouraged because low interest and even no interest loans are available to producers that are not available to consumers. What reserves are required to operate a sound bank on the standard? I have no clue. Anyone who does is operating from a pretense of knowledge. Most likely it will depend upon the type of new wealth being produced. Certainly the banking needs of a wheat farm are much different than a car wash. And as market conditions change, reserves will correspondingly change. Merchants are free to issue their own notes. The first banks evolved from merchants offering new wealth on the gold standard. Only later did commercial banking become an industry in its own right. The Bitcoin standard is not required for sound banking on the standard. Lightning Network is not required, although both are utilized in final settlements. Centralized accounting procedures suffice. Seigniorage shifts from a government monopoly to the issuing banks or merchants. It is conceivable, and this author believes likely, that the float alone is enough to keep a sound bank profitable, eliminating interest entirely for short-term commercial loans. Free Bitcoin standard banking develops trusted third parties, addressing the scalability issue. Just as gold acted as the governor of the gold standard, Bitcoin is the governor of the Bitcoin standard. In free market banking, Bitcoin legal tender is not only unnecessary, but becomes a political anathema, opening the door to Bitcoin crony capitalism. And there's references all through these articles that if you're listening to this, I do recommend that you go to the article and hit the links. It's just a wealth of information and links. This article is Are Legal Tender Laws an Oxymoron, which is another article that I wrote addressing that issue. Free market sound commercial Bitcoin standard banking opens the door for new wealth creation. It also invites innovation in that it depends not on the wealthy whale hodlers, but on sound money practices that have been forgotten and lost and can be rediscovered by all men of integrity, regardless of wealth or social status. So long as sound commercial banking principles are followed, this lost art can be relearned and practiced by anyone with market savvy and an Excel spreadsheet. Such thinking will likely be considered Bitcoin maximalist heresy, but a fiat 100% reserve standard bank is not the same thing as Bitcoin standard banking in a free and unfettered marketplace operating in the absence of any fixed reserves. With the emergence of free market sound commercial banking, the use case for hodlers, those who choose to hold their own keys to be the bank of last resort, also emerges. While use of gold as money is hardly a new innovation, the gold standard was a new innovation that emerged in an era of relatively free market banking. And while gold cannot be traced to the anonymous discoverer, the gold standard can be traced to Adam Smith's invisible hand of the marketplace. As the gold standard emerged, there was no fractional reserve gold standard decreed by governments. The money supply was determined by banks, creating a non-inflationary, self-liquidating commercial paper that represented an estimate of all production, including gold, coming into the marketplace. Gold simply acted as a governor when the market participants perceived that an individual bank overestimated the value of specific underlying production. It was only later, when the gold standard was nationalized by governments, decreed fractional gold reserves, creating the business cycle by perverting sound commercial banking that organically evolved in the marketplace. Read that sentence again. It was only later, when the gold standard was nationalized, that governments decreed fractional gold reserves, creating the business cycle by perverting sound commercial banking that organically evolved in the marketplace. Citadel versus community. And there's links here. Perhaps the greatest challenge of the Bitcoin techie crowd preaching decentralization of the Bitcoin standard is to practice what is preached. Too often, the message comes from the top down rather than teaching by example from the bottom up. I do not mean to diminish theory. Practice without theory is blind, but theory without practice is dead. I have learned from minds far greater than my own. Nor I am saying there is no place for scholarly institutions. But there is a tendency towards elitism in the Bitcoin community. Free market banking on the Bitcoin standard is open to anyone living in a community creating wealth and having access to a printing press and an Excel spreadsheet. If, as Bitcoiners, we are our own banks, then it is high time we act like it. Free banking is open to all and is not limited to the Michael Saylors and Jack Mallers and the Bitcoin whales of this world. The same opportunity exists for 10,000 or even 100,000 micro banks to emerge spontaneously, operating solely on the Bitcoin standard for those with the courage to act quickly, practicing sound commercial banking. Just as Bitcoin emerged organically, spontaneously, without permission and without regulation, so can free market banking emerge from anyone willing to assume the existential risks, which will become evident with success, just like with Bitcoin. Citadel mentality is a static siege mentality guaranteed to eventually be overrun. Strength comes through building a dynamic community mentality with those who have little or no knowledge of sound money, but operate daily in the marketplace and can be taught by example. The demise of the fiat standard will launch the Wild West of sound banking opportunities for those with vision, fortitude, and daring to meet the need. Bitcoin is cash. Cash is a banking mechanism devised for the consumer by merchants as a convenient way to convert labor to the new wealth offered in the marketplace by wealth creators. Under the gold standard prior to 1863 and under the gold standard prior to excuse me, under the gold standard. Prior to 1863, banks and merchants created banknotes redeemable for fixed weight of gold or silver. These notes were not legal tender and were not required to be accepted for payment of debt or any other goods and services offered in the marketplace. However, once accepted, redemption of legal tender gold and silver was legally required. It was estimated that 8,000 different private banknotes were issued from 1830 to 1860. Now, this changed in 1861 when Congress authorized printing money to fund the Civil War with greenbacks, declaring it legal tender and creating the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Later, Lincoln's message of the National Bank Acts of 1863 and 1864 established a system of national banks and created the United States national banking system. These acts encouraged the development of a national currency backed by bank holdings of U.S. Treasury securities and established the Office of Comptroller of the Currency as part of the United States Department of Treasury and a system of nationally chartered banks. Thus, in the late 19th century, most paper money was issued by federal or state chartered commercial banks. Below is a picture of private issue issued by a Bank of Indiana in 1857. Note what it says. The Citizens Bank of Gosport will pay $5 on demand to the bearer Gosport, July 1st, 1857. This bill was not legal tender, which means that a person could refuse to accept it. If a person took this bill to the bank, they issued it, the bank was legally required to give him legal tender, which before the Civil War was gold or silver coin. And there's a picture of this banknote. Gosport is a tiny town in southern Indiana that no longer has a bank. This bank was a fraudulent institution whose notes were put in circulation far and wide. It was declared an illegal institution by Judge Parker in 1858. When a bank or a company went out of business in the 19th century, all the paper money it had issued became worthless. But people had a reluctance to throw it away because it once had been worth something. So they stuck it in the attic. As a result of those banks that went out of business, left many banknotes that are in collections or attics. Kind of like shit coins, guys. It's just when these shit coins go down, they're pretty well worthless, but people still hold them. They don't even know they have them. In contrast, the vast majority of banks were sound, and because they did not go out of business, eventually they redeemed the paper money that they issued. So these notes are extremely rare and valuable collector pieces today. This was the market origin of non-inflationary self-liquidating commercial paper and commercial banking. And I put a picture of one of these, a banknote from a sound bank that redeemed all their certificates. Those are truly rare. This is a truly collector's piece because they were always worth something, and most all of them got redeemed. So if you saved one of those, it now has a value much higher than it's a genuine collector's piece. It's a genuine, I guess they call them NFTs, but it's a real item, guys. And there's a picture of it here that actually it's graded by the Paper Money Guarantee, a grading company, so they can. I'm not a collector of paper money, but people that are, it's a big industry. My point is, like the Bitcoin standard, the gold standard emerged organically in the free marketplace. Only after it became evident it worked so well was it nationalized in stages. Okay, free banking in Scotland. Now, so far, I've limited this article to free market banking in the United States, yet the examples are hardly perfect due to charters, limited jurisdiction, branching restrictions, small note specie restrictions, and decreed reserves, which are discussed at length in my first book, How to Put Yourself on the Gold Standard in One Easy Lesson. A far better example is free banking that existed in Scotland, which flourished from 1716 to 1845. And I included an excellent podcast by Nick Carter and Lawrence White that I highly recommend, outlining free market banking in the United States and Scotland and how this history suggests the path to sound Bitcoin banking beginning at the 25-minute mark. Again, if you're listening to this, I do recommend you go back and pull up the article either from uglyoldgoat.com or on Medium, so you can go to these links. There's a lot of links in this article. Interestingly, the estimated reserve for banknotes issued by sound banks was 2 to 4% and 20% capital reserves. suggesting a new industry is open to small hodlers. Of particular interest is Lauren White's chicken and egg analogy on Bitcoin volatility. Commercial banking ends volatility but has difficulty emerging in a volatile market. A non-fiat Bitcoin standard has the potential to break this barrier. Free banking in Zimbabwe. Incredibly, free market banking also was once prevalent in Zimbabwe, then known as Rhodesia, and was a proposed solution by Stephen Hanke for that nation's hyperinflation. Quoting Stephen Hanke, one monetary regime that would stop Zimbabwe's hyperinflation is free banking. Under this system, private bank issue notes, paper money, and other liabilities with minimal regulation. A completely free banking system has no central bank, no lender of last resort, no reserve requirements, and no legal restrictions on bank portfolios, interest rates, or branch banking. Free banking systems have existed in nearly 60 countries during the 1800s and early 1900s. Zimbabwe had free banking from the time the first bank was established in 1892 until the government replaced the free banking with a currency board in 1940. Zimbabwe's free banking was among the least restricted that ever existed. At the time, the country had only two commercial banks, the Standard Bank of South Africa and the Bank of Africa, later part of Barclays Bank. Excuse me. They issued notes denominated in pounds and kept their privately issued pounds equal to the pound sterling, except during the First World War and a few years afterwards, when the local pound floated along with the South African pound, the predecessor of the rand, against the pound sterling. Free banking ended in Zimbabwe, not because it performed poorly, but because the government desired the profit from issuing the notes. But this leads to the question, why have any proposed legislative solution at all? Would not a better solution come from the bottom up than from the top down? For a deep dive into the case for free banking history, I would suggest the works of the following free banking pioneers: Lawrence White, George Selgin, Richard Timberlake, Stephen Hanke, and others who followed FAI's footsteps. For even a deeper dive into free banking scholarship, check this out. And there's a student, I think of Lawrence White or George Selgin, that has a complete, you really want to go on a deep dive, it's there. We all have a confirmation bias. Now, I no more expect Saif to change his view on 100% reserve banking than he will change my view opposing it. We all come from different backgrounds with different belief systems hardwired into our thinking. These biases are not without foundation, and Saifedean Ammous has once again outlined the foundation for future discussion. My purpose is simply to show that the idea of a 100% reserve banking system is inconsistent with the premise of the fiat standard. I firmly embrace opposition to the latter and demur to the former. The origins of bank secrecy. It's no accident that bank secrecy developed in Switzerland, or that Scotland and 19th century Rhodesia, modern Zimbabwe, have the richest history in free banking as Calvinism prevailed in all three. Or that free banking was successfully practiced in Puritan New England. Swiss banking emerged first from wealthy secular northern Italian and Jewish merchants and Calvinists who, unlike pious Catholics and Muslims, had no aversion to charging interest efficiently and at low cost, distinguished from usury. The first, this is quoting from the Saudi journals, the first information on Swiss bankers are traced to the 13th century, with the arrival of wealthy Italian and Jewish merchants to what is today modern-day Swiss. During the Renaissance, or since the 1400 trade shows, are beginning to take place in Geneva and other surrounding cities which attract merchants and other financial experts. They mark the cornerstone for the Swiss banking system. With the onset of the Reformation in the 16th century, led by Calvin in Geneva and Zwingli in Zurich, Switzerland becomes a partially Protestant country, which made it easier to conduct banking and lending of money, something that had been seriously condemned by the church, as already stated. Calvinism reflected not only the doctrines of sola scriptura, sola fide, and sola gratia, but also the doctrine of sovereignty of God, election, predestination, a biblical doctrine largely forsaken by nominal American Christians. The Bible was no longer chained to the pulpit. Salvation no longer came from Rome. Revelation from God came directly from the Lord to the common man through written scriptures, not interpreted by the church or prophets from the top down. For the reformers, regeneration came from the Holy Spirit, not from the church. Priesthood was an office held by all believers. The Roman Catholics and the Muslims both considered interest as unlawful usury. Wealthy Roman Catholics justified the use of sound banking provided by Calvinist Jews and the secular Northern Italians, since they were going to hell anyway, while Islam considered them all infidels. Lutheran doctrine embraced the union of church and state as a carryover from Roman Catholic tradition, while the Anabaptists were anathema to all. In his epic work, Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Max Weber traces the foundation of capitalism to what is known as the Calvinistic work ethic, or Puritan work ethic, which emphasizes that diligence, discipline, frugality are the result of a person's subscriptions to values espoused by the Protestant faith, particularly John Calvin. American exceptionalism did not emerge from the secular pride evident today, but from humility and recognition we are by nature evil, depraved, and unable to be lifted up to righteousness by our own efforts, but for the grace of God. Saife's predispositions should be no surprise to any student of history, and I love the way he squarely addresses it. I get frustrated with those who think Bitcoin is exclusively secular or espouse the contradiction that there are no absolutes, so absolutes, including God, should be left out of the discussion. And there's a link here to an interview that Saifedean did with an Islamic finance and an economist. A very, very interesting interview. In days past, mortgage lending and automobile loans required a corresponding amount of savings for the loan, and banks simply matched the savers and lenders for a fee with interest. These were known as savings and loan institutions and are distinguished from self-liquidating commercial paper. While the self-liquidating paper was issued for the house builder or the automobile manufacturer who creates a new wealth, savings are required in a mortgage to the consumer of wealth, whether it be for a home or an automobile loan. While the Muslim objection to riba may hold in a savings and loan structure, such is not the case in the innovation of self-liquidating commercial paper, sound commercial banking, which offers short-term discounted notes representing new wealth being offered in the marketplace. In this sense, the bank both shares the risk of the producer while sharing the benefits of success, which, according to my understanding of the Muslim faith, is an anti-riba model. Due to the float, no interest loans are likely to emerge for consistent wealth producers. Below Saif interviews professing Christian Jimmy Song, a co-author of Thank God for Bitcoin. Jimmy voices the view he is actually living in sin due to the nature of ex nihilo money creation in today's mortgage banking. Jimmy raises a point, but it is the fiat banking system with fiat reserves and modern Protestants marching back to Rome that's created this moral dilemma. The legacy system and Bitcoin integration. There is a current disturbing trend of integration of Bitcoin with the legacy system. This is akin to the sound money movement shooting itself in the foot. The argument is that regulation is a good thing, or if not a good thing, it's unavoidable. Entitlements and regulations are not going to go away, so we may as well embrace them so that the right regulations can be imposed in the marketplace. This, of course, begs the question, does Bitcoin really provide an alternative? Or is it simply a new paradigm granting a brief reprieve that is quickly degenerating into centralized control? In 2021 alone, first came the adoption of KYC and AML regulations by major exchanges. This came in a belated response to the Wild West unregulated exchanges that were prevalent in the first 7 years of Bitcoin that resulted in hacks, frauds, and defaults, but had already self-corrected. In the same period, exchange innovations emerged that threatened the very existence of regulated legacy exchanges, leading to civil and criminal prosecutions for those innovators who refused to comply with legacy exchanges through the commodity industry, stacked with regulators of the CFTC and the enforcement arm of central banks through the Department of Justice. It is disconcerting, but not surprising, But legacy exchanges are persecuting the founders of BitMEX civilly through the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, and central banks are criminally prosecuting them through the Department of Justice. And the 2020 Bitcoin standard bearers are Arthur Hayes, Benjamin Dalo, Samuel Reed, and Greg Dreyer from BitMEX, because well, I'm not going to go into the history of that here. You can look that up. The United States enforces national laws requiring tribute from those operating in foreign jurisdictions who do business with U.S. citizens. Yet the federal government takes no actions against citizens who, through fraud and deceit, hide their identity from foreign businesses. The ugly American is alive and well. Second came the declaration of Bitcoin as legal tender, clearly putting Bitcoin in the political arena. Third comes regulatory approval of ETFs. All three mark a shift from Bitcoin as an independent entity, free from regulation, to a commodity wrapped in regulation and the easy threat of seizure from the political powers that be. The Fiat standard is visionary because it clearly identifies this challenge. All regulation imposes the Fiat standard. Safe has laid a solid foundation for further colloquy, just as he did with the Bitcoin standard. We may not agree with all of Safe's conclusions, but he has once again set the stage for future discussion with his visionary Fiat standard. This is why it is such an important work. Bitcoin crony capitalism and the Fiat Bitcoin standard. As outlined earlier, there's a strong tendency to incorporate the Bitcoin standard into the legacy system. This de-evolutionary trend is occurring at an exponential rate when compared to the de-evolution of the gold standard, which reached its most advanced level of the development in the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. While technology provided a useful tool that is secure, easily transferred through national borders, unconfiscatable so long as you own the keys, censorship resistant, and decentralized, these innovative attributes are quickly being forsaken by those who know or should know better. As the saying goes, Bitcoin does things faster. Sound money advocates, and Bitcoin advocates in particular, need to be careful so as not to apply the Fiat standard to Bitcoin, as was done with the gold standard with the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. It took 4 generations to undo the Fiat gold standard. The adage is that things happen faster with Bitcoin. Unless present trends are recognized and addressed, the Fiat Bitcoin standard could undo Bitcoin in 4 decades or even 4 years. Each generation will need to be diligent to keep sound money. Bitcoin without human action has no value. Our values are determined by our future human actions. Sound money banking and currency competition. The standard was renamed by Hayek for a reason. And I'll link to this article. You want to go, this is one that was written back in October 2018. Lots of stuff here, but a particular thing is this article here. 1986, Hayek actually saw the need for a standard, and he did not think there would be competing private standards, but one standard would emerge that competes with the governments. So I'll let you guys, great links in this article, guys. So if you're listening to this, go back and read it and check out the links. Bitcoin is not a base metal or a physical commodity. It is a number on a secure digital network. Bitcoin does many amazing things, but Bitcoin is not a Star Trek transporter, nor does it create wealth. Private competition with national currencies could well incentivize nation states to provide sound money and even return to the gold standard. Just as the physical properties of gold are well suited to geographic boundaries, the digital properties of Bitcoin are well suited beyond geographic boundaries and will likely develop to reward good nation-state actors while punishing bad nation-state actors. Just as gold acted as a governor in the emergence of the 19th century gold standard, Bitcoin can act as the governor in the emergence of the 21st century Bitcoin standard by encouraging competing national currencies. And just like gold, it is likely Bitcoin will play only a small role in the daily life of nation-state commerce. But just like gold, Bitcoin specie can emerge as a viable alternative. sound money banking and currency competition on a gold standard among nations as a way to keep Bitcoin crony capitalism in check. Moreover, the most effective attack against Bitcoin is for nation states to provide sound money and restore the gold standard. Bitcoin fundamentalists argue because Bitcoin is anti-fragile, such attacks should be embraced and welcomed. Two competing sound money standards strengthens both. The Bitcoin standard can keep nation states honest by providing an escape from legal tender abuses and providing sound money both within and outside borders, while nation states can limit the usage of the Bitcoin standard by providing sound money within their borders and providing a variety of platforms for innovation. Nor does this mean that a plethora of private standards better than Bitcoin will emerge. And here's a link of an article by my good friend Tone Vase, which outlines that. So Bitcoin, the innovation, provides a means to relearn the lost art of commercial banking. Again, there's a link to this. If you want to read about the lost art of commercial banking, there it is, and which I do highly recommend. Anyway, the Bitcoin the innovation provides a means to relearn the lost art of commercial banking and create useful specie in transparent ways never before possible. Yes, mistakes will be made in free market sound money banking on the Bitcoin standard. That is how we learn. Like Ethereum, this new generation of Bitcoin standard bankers will run around and break things, but unlike Ethereum, the underlying Bitcoin standard is sound. The damage is limited. Some banks will fail, but Bitcoin and the Bitcoin standard combined with sound banking principles will emerge by men who have integrity. The Fiat standard may prove to be a more important visionary work than the Bitcoin standard, in that its goal is sound money. If sound money is restored, Bitcoin no longer has a use case. Hodl, 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 save, 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 build a, sound money, sound money. Note the jingle is not it's for sound money, not Bitcoin. Let's see if I can play this. We're going to do this. This is how we start off our shows. Okay, we start off on the left side, and we go, hodl, 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 save, 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 build a, sound money, sound money. All right, and hodl, 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 save, 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 build a, sound money, sound money. Hey, hodl, 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 save, 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 build a, sound money, sound money. Hey, hodl, hodl, save, 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 build a, sound money, sound money. All right. Save, 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 build a, sound money, sound money. Save, 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 build a, sound money, sound money. Hey, save, 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 build a, sound money, sound money. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed. Satoshi Sound made that for us when he was here. What a great video. Thank you so much, Satoshi Sound. Okay, so addendum. Are we really free at all? So this is an addendum because this is more theological than Bitcoinish, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. It kind of goes into the spiritual side of Bitcoin. Are we really free at all? Can sound money be anything more than a fleeting moment in time? The Reformation brought modern civilization human freedom, at least freedom in a secular sense. But these reformers were grounded in the freedom in Christ that was based on the sovereignty of God, not the atheist Ayn Rand's subjectivism or Murray Rothbard's libertarian notion of the sovereign individual and anarcho-capitalism. Again, there's links. All these are links, guys. So if you want to kind of see where I'm coming from, come back and hit those links. The reformers argued true freedom was a gift from God. Their faith was in what is to come, and not in this world ruled by men, but in the everlasting new heaven and new earth promised to his people by a loving Emmanuel, God with us. This life is a temporary journey. God is sovereign, and man was created in God's image. And for this reason, God reveals himself to his people through the logos, or logic, or word of God, scriptures. As my good friend and mentor, John Robbins, pointed out, all men are descendants of Adam. All are made of one blood. And the minds of all men are illuminated by the same logic, the logos of God. Mises admitted in one of the statements that I quoted this morning that he could not prove that all men have the same logic, but Christians can so prove, and the proof is found in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. Paul teaches we are all slaves to sin or slaves to Christ. Martin Luther considered the greatest issue of his day was the notion that mankind was has free will in his rebuttal of the bondage of the will to the Catholic Erasmus's treatise on free will. A more concise summary of this re-emerging issue can be found here. Jesus answered perplexed Nicodemus with, "You must be born again." The implication is salvation is no more a choice than being physically born. Isaiah does not write about inviting Emmanuel into your heart, but rather his people are engraved in the palms of his hands. Only with regeneration by the Holy Spirit are his people able to respond with a willingness. His people are commanded to work out their faith with fear and trembling. His people have a particular and irresistible grace that no power can undo. The sin and death did not come into the world through Eve, but through Adam. Eve was deceived, not Adam. Adam knew full well what he was doing and chose to follow the woman. Yet the seed or promise was planted in Eve before Adam sinned. Abraham is the father of faith. Isaac was the promised son. Ishmael was the blessed first son, yet was not the son of promise. His blessing came directly from Allah, not from Abraham. Moreover, not all of Israel is Israel. Rebekah's children were conceived by one man, Isaac. Yet before twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's plan of election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. So it is written, for Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. Jesus instructed where to look to be free from the snake bite of sin. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must, that everyone who believes may have eternal life. Samuel warned what would happen when Israel demanded an earthly king. Turning to the scriptures, the reformers restored the idea of government limited to punish evildoers both within, civil, and without defense of the nation, and praised the good. The only legitimate Fiat standard revealed from a sovereign God is limited, written, and understood in the hearts of men. None are with an excuse. Jesus Christ summed up the law first, love God, and second, love your neighbor as yourself. Self-love is presumed and hardwired by our Creator. With obedience of faith in Christ's finished work comes this assurance that all things work for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. The finished work, good news, an object of faith as Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and he was buried and that he rose again on the third day according to the scriptures. The streets of heaven are paved with gold like transparent glass. I wonder if that's Bitcoin, since security is no longer an issue when sin is done away. Scripture reveals we will worship, work, eat, and drink in glorified everlasting physical bodies. Without sin, no private keys are required. Bitcoin and gold are sound money, prudent, and may bring respite on earth for a time until the last of his people are gathered. But for Christians, our hope is in neither gold nor Bitcoin, but in what was accomplished and finished 2,000 years ago. It is here alone we look and have faith. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all those he has given me, but raise them up in the last day. John 6:39. In understanding, be men. I pray this helps you be bold, yet put gold and Bitcoin in the proper perspective. Ugly old goat. And of course, all of my articles can be reprinted so long as you give me full credit. Thank you guys for reading. If you read this article, please clap. That helps me with Medium, builds my circulation. I get paid a pittance for writing articles on there. I write it because it's easy format and I'm not very technically oriented. If you want to support my work, I do recommend you the Bitcoin Start Kit. It's $199.95 and you get my 2 books, signed books, hard copy books. You get the Bitcoin Money by Bitcoin Rabbi, Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean, Knut, Svanholm's Sovereignty Through Mathematics, Jimmy Song's little Bitcoin book, a Jade. You also get at least one other item that we just throw in there. And it's a way that you can support my work, and just hit the link and let's see if we can do this here, and you'll go here and show you how to order. Maybe. There it is. So there it is, and you can pick the you just fill out the thing. It's $199.95 plus shipping. It's I think it's, I don't know, $10 shipping, or if you're in the U.S. and overseas is more. So at any rate, I appreciate you guys listening. I hope you enjoyed this. I spent a lot of time writing this, and so I do hope you'll be able to get back. There's a lot of information here if you want to do a deep dive on self-liquidating commercial paper and the Bitcoin standard. Thank you for tuning in.